Hello, I'm Ryan, and welcome to my channel, Analyze This, Mr. Bond, where I discuss the adventures of James Bond 007 and dig for what lies beneath the surface. And today, in a very special installment, we are digging into Ian Fleming's Casino Royale, the book that introduced James Bond to the world. This is a video I do with some trepidation. There's kind of a weight of expectation around this. This is the first James Bond novel. This is the story in which this character was given life. And I wasn't sure how I would feel about the novel when I returned to it. I've read Casino Royale many times. In fact, I've described myself as more of a fan of the literary Bond than I am of the cinematic Bond. Yes, the movies were my introduction to the character, but it's really the literary Bond who has a firm place in my heart as an adult. But I wasn't really sure whether I would find Casino Royale as rewarding as I remembered it to be. Reading it, I was mostly amazed at how fully formed Ian Fleming's style felt in his first turn at bat, how well defined the world of James Bond was. It's all really here. If you were to only read one Bond novel, and it was Casino Royale, the entire essence of Fleming's Bond is right here for you. And I think that's the greatest thing you can say about Casino Royale. I don't think it is Ian Fleming's greatest Bond novel, but I think in some ways it just so completely encapsulates what Fleming was attempting to do with this literary project. What impresses me so much about Ian Fleming's writing in this novel is that right out of the gate, he has a talent for making atmosphere thrilling. This is a very brisk, riveting read, but there's actually not a lot that happens in the novel from a plot perspective. It's a very talky book. There's not really that much that happens in Casino Royale. It's a book about atmosphere, about introspection. It spends a lot of time just observing Bond and how he inhabits spaces, what he's feeling, what he's doing, how he drifts through these places that have their own history and background. Fleming has such a talent for making a world come alive, and his characters are extensions of that world. James Bond is notably somewhat of a piece with the environment he inhabits. The way Ian Fleming defines characters is he defines them very clearly through their appearance. James Bond is famously a character who is described by what he wears, the car he drives, the food he eats, what he drinks. It is a character who is defined by his lifestyle, and it's an approach that Fleming applies to his other characters. These characters are defined vividly by what they look like, what they choose to wear, how they hold their cigarette. Fleming sees the depth in appearance and spends a lot of time describing those appearances and finding the depths in them. And I really enjoy that approach. He's such a gripping writer. In fact, I would argue that Casino Royale has one of the best opening lines of any novel. The scent and smoke and sweat of a casino are nauseating at 3 a.m. It's said that a picture is worth 1,000 words. Well, sometimes a sentence is worth a whole movie. The way he writes just feels like a seamless extension of James Bond himself. Let's talk a little bit about James Bond in this novel. Casino Royale is something of an origin story for James Bond. He's a fully fledged agent in this story, but the story very clearly positions Bond as not quite a rookie, but someone who hasn't yet been humbled by life. In many ways, this book is the humbling of an arrogant agent who hasn't really come up against his own fallibility. That's actually a term Ian Fleming uses in the novel to describe Bond's experience, that Bond really hasn't been tested by fate. And Casino Royale is really a novel about an agent who's a little reckless, who hasn't really fallen in love before, who hasn't confronted death the way that Bond confronts death in this novel, and it shakes Bond to his core. But otherwise, Bond is very fully formed here. He's a professional secret agent with a very cold, dark sensibility. He's described in Fleming's visual terms as having a very ruthless demeanor. There's a sense in which Bond is a loner. One of the more interesting details that stuck out to me when reading Casino Royale this time was Bond's admission to Vesper when they're having dinner together that the reason he cares so much about food is in part because he's a very detail-oriented person, but also just because he eats alone a lot. And when you eat alone, paying attention to the details, paying attention to what you're eating, fills the space. That gives some interesting color to James Bond's obsession with details. He is a loner who lives in a profession where he is a hired killer. Bond does not have any illusions about the glamour of his profession. Over the course of the novel, he's going to find his own sense of purpose, but he sees himself very much as a civil servant. One of the things that is very interesting is that when he's explaining how he got his 00, he admits that the people he killed to get his 00 might not have been bad people. He was just operating on behalf of his orders, and that's what a secret agent does. There's a certain cynicism about his profession, especially at the start of this novel, and in many ways, this book is about him pushing beyond that cynicism to find a new sense of motivation, which is what he arrives at after the trial of this story. Bond is a character of appetites, kind of filling a void in his life because he is, as Mathis describes him at one point in the book, a machine. Bond is a machine who works for the British government. And he's not always a particularly nice fellow, but he's a contradictory individual. He is simultaneously a character who is deeply misogynistic. He kind of resents women. When Vesper is kidnapped in this book, Bond falls back into the classic cliche of misogyny, where he starts to muse, women should just stay in the kitchen and shouldn't get caught up in all this spy business. There's this hard-edged resentment of women. The novel is very clear that Bond uses women only for pleasure, but it's a paradox, and Fleming is aware of the paradox of the Bond character because he's simultaneously this ruthless, cold killer who has no time for emotional connection, and a character with a very sentimental side, a very soft side, a very philosophical side. We see just how sentimental and tender and emotionally impulsive Bond gets in the back half of this novel after he's been put through such an ordeal, and he's almost flailing, grasping for emotional connection with a woman who is increasingly remote from him. And you really see the distress of that. In fact, one thing that strikes me about Fleming's Bond here is that Fleming's Bond likes to almost monologue. He is very philosophical. He's very talky in a way that the movies never really let Bond be. The way that Bond expounds at length about God and the devil to Mathis at one point in this book when he's talking about how he's kind of given up on the delineation between good and evil in this business. It's very philosophical. That paradox is what Fleming is really testing here. Fleming has a line here about how all men of Bond's type have this kind of tension between their cold hard ruthlessness and their sentimentality. And Bond embodies that tension pretty radically throughout this book. There's a constant sense of Bond wrestling with his own emotions when Vesper enters his world while he's on his assignment at Casino Royale, and he has to pull back from that. As much as Bond is a machine, he's a machine that loves life, even as he takes it from other people. Bond begins this story fully committed to his assignment, but it's not long before his balance is shaken and there's an assassination attempt on his life. And we immediately get a sense from Fleming how Bond likes to recover. And Bond is recovering with foie gras at a restaurant immediately after That is the essence of the Fleming Bond character, and it just shows how well defined James Bond is right from the outset in this series. Fleming is very aware of the way in which he is positioning Bond as this icon of extreme masculine virility and self-destructive tendencies. There's not really a lot of subtlety about that brew here for Bond in the story. And so a lot of the tensions lurking beneath the surface in Bond's psychology here are really just very clearly delineated from the outset. Bond is described by many other characters as being particularly tough, particularly extreme in his attitudes towards alcohol. It's no surprise that the big climactic event of this story is in many ways Bond's torture at the hands of his enemy, Le Chiffre, and that the target of that torture is Bond's primary organ of virility, that it is about a direct attack on Bond's manhood. In fact, after that torture occurs and Bond survives it, much of Bond's subsequent motivation for pursuing a romantic relationship with Vesper is about him proving that he is back up to speed, reassuring himself that he has been able to recover his own sense of masculinity and virility. And Fleming's not shy about that. In many ways, Bond's romance with Vesper is not one of the great love stories. It's a story about a man projecting onto a somewhat reserved girl all of his own longings and insecurities. That's a perfect gateway to talk about Vesper's function in the story, because she is the other focal point of this story. She is the girl that breaks Bond's heart. Bond falls in some form of love with her because he loses clarity about his own self in this book. And he's very attracted to Vesper, and Vesper is the person who mothers him back to health after he goes through this deep psychological crisis. It's a crisis about his own identity. It's a crisis about his job. It's a crisis about the lines between good and evil, where he no longer feels that he can rely on the political boundaries of the world to delineate between good and evil anymore. He's lost himself in this fog of war, and she's a beacon of light, and he's reaching out to her. And similarly for Vesper, Bond is just kind of an emblem for her. If you haven't read Casino Royale or haven't seen the movie, the big emphasis of Vesper's character is that she's a double agent working this whole time. She's been blackmailed into supporting the Soviets here and is actively working against Bond for much of this story, and feels so profoundly guilty about it that she feels obligated to nurse Bond back to life. It's such a doomed romance, two people projecting their own failings and longings onto each other. But there's something charming about it, something charming about their light interactions together, the way Fleming centers their relationship really around enjoying food together. That's really the way that Bond and Vesper connect in this book. They connect over their excitement about food, and all of their major events together kind of focus on wining and dining together and the enjoyment they're able to share in that together. That's really what brings out the spark of attraction for both of them, is the excitement of that. And Vesper, being something of a restrained character with a mysterious story, does not have a lot of active voice in the story. She's a character we see through Bond's eyes. She's very reserved. And in many ways, we, the reader, are able to project onto her the same way that Bond is able to project on her. In many ways, Vesper becomes a cipher that both we, the reader, and Bond are projecting onto over the course of this story, even though I think the attentive reader will be aware of the ways in which Bond seems to be glossing over all these warning signs with Vesper. In many ways, the tragedy of this book is that their love could never really be, and that is the deep, stinging wound that happens for both of them. If I have criticism about the way Fleming portrays the Vesper character here, it's that Fleming will go on to create female characters that are much more vivid and specific, in creating a character who is so much of a cipher. She's a character that feels defined by her role in Bond's story. She's a mechanism by which Bond will confront himself. It doesn't make her as memorable as some of the female characters that will follow. As much as she's endearing, I really like when she shows up to meet Bond for dinner and she's worried about her velvet Dior dress that she's borrowed. It's very human and nicely captures her vulnerability as a character. And certainly she is very vulnerable. She becomes the damsel in distress during the key dramatic pivot of the novel, where she is quote-unquote captured by Le Chiffre and Bond is lured to follow her. Bond will always have a preoccupation in the Fleming stories with protecting women who are in trouble. There's something in which Bond finds his sense of identity in being a sort of protector figure. And in many ways, that's how this novel concludes. Bond goes through an existential crisis in which he can't really discern good from evil very easily after he's had his entire sense of identity shaken. And what he ends up concluding, with the help of Mathis, is that he really needs to be anchored in the experiences of people. You know who the evil people are because they're the people inflicting suffering on the human beings around you. So it's only by caring that you're able to find your way through the mess of politics and figure out who the good and evil people are. And Bond resolves at the end of this novel to get at the people who could do such a horrible thing as to take a girl like Vesper and turn her into a double agent. And part of that machine is the villain of this story, Le Chiffre himself. It's notable that Le Chiffre's name, the number, mirrors Bond's own identity as 007. They are both numbers. They are both working for governments. Le Chiffre is obviously corrupt and decadent. Fleming has a penchant for describing characters through the ways they look, the ways they behave. Le Chiffre is a character who is essentially a gangster. He's involved in brothels. He gambles excessively. He inhales Benzedrine at the table. But in many ways, these vices are all mirroring Bond. Bond also plays cards. Bond also has his hedonistic impulses. Bond also has a penchant for copious amounts of alcohol. Bond also is reckless and gets himself in trouble. These characters are very purposefully mirrored, and you see that in the way that both the story sets them up as opposite figures from one another and the way that Bond reflects on their opposition. Bond, after having suffered his torture at the hands of Le Chiffre, and after Le Chiffre has been executed for failing the Soviet machine, he reflects that really they're both tools in this larger system. He says this to Mathis. Mathis doesn't take Bond very seriously. It's a very wonderful chapter where Bond is being incredibly introspective and simultaneously naive, and Mathis is refusing to take any of his musing seriously while also humoring Bond. But there's this sense in which Bond sees this entire experience where he's just been drawn out into an assignment, messed up, and has suffered grievously for it. It doesn't carry a lot of weight, because if he had succeeded, if he had gotten off scot-free, what would he have achieved? He would just have bankrupted another Soviet agent. Mathis asks him to surround himself with human beings as a response. And that's why I've chosen that as the title of this video, because I think that's the most interesting idea in this book, is that Bond finds his purpose by connecting with his humanity, a humanity that is distant from him at the start of this book. And he tries to, at the very final second of this book, pull himself back into a humanity that has been distant from himself throughout the book. In many ways, the book is about Bond being forced to violently confront that humanity, and he doesn't quite know what to do with it. Even at the very end of the book, the famous last line of this novel, where he is recoiling from the death of Vesper, it shows Bond kind of retreating into Bond the machine, Bond the human giving over to Bond the secret agent machine, who is going to go and find the people that did this to him and destroy them. This lays out the template for what Fleming's project is going to be. Bond is a clear character who has resigned himself to his duty, but is continually wrestling with the inner sentimentality and humanity. A character who has filled the space in his life with hedonism, his appetite for food and drink and fine cars and clothing. A Bond who has surrendered himself over to being a machine of the state and finds some way to recover a little bit of his humanity here, tapping into it enough to find some sense of purpose in destroying the bad men of the world. It's a pretty good start, and it's going to lead in very organically to the follow-up, Live and Let Die, which we'll be discussing at the end of next month, and I'm really looking forward to doing that. But I have very much enjoyed reading Casino Royale. I hope you will all take this opportunity to revisit it if you haven't done so. Even if you aren't going to read the book, the recent audiobook version that's come out is great and is a wonderful way to experience this novel for the first time. I'll probably be doing a follow-up video to talk about the Daniel Craig adaptation of it. But all in all, I have to say, I found this a pretty satisfying way to meet one of culture's most famous characters. So thanks for bearing with my fairly rambling analysis of Ian Fleming's Casino Royale, and I'll catch you in the next one.